The scent of burnt coffee and old wood always clung to my apron by the end of a shift, but tonight it was worse. A storm had rolled over the valley, and every hunter and merchant who'd been caught in it tracked mud and rain straight into the tavern. I confess this much, even to myself, in the quiet of my own head. I was tired of being invisible. 5 years I'd worked at the Hollow Pine Inn, the only tavern within walking distance of the northern border, where the great packs of the Alpha Kingdom sent their soldiers to trade and drink and forget, for a few hours, the weight of their hierarchies. 5 years of refilling tankards for men twice my size who never once looked at my face, only at the tray in my hands, or through me entirely, the way you'd look through a window. I didn't blame them. I'd learned a long time ago that pale hair and a quiet voice didn't draw attention in a world built for wolves who measured worth in strength and bloodline. I was human, fully, plainly human, in a town that orbited the moon-blessed packs the way moths orbit a flame, close enough to feel the heat, never close enough to be consumed by it. That suited me fine. I'd seen what happened to women who got too close to that fire. Table 6 needs another round, Josie, and don't dawdle. The Voss envoy's getting restless. Mira called from behind the bar, not unkindly. She was the only one here who used my name instead of just snapping her fingers. I balanced the tray and wove between tables. Between boots and broadswords leaned carelessly against chair legs. Between conversations in low, growling tones I'd long since trained myself not to listen to. That was a rule I kept, quiet as a held breath. Don't listen to what the wolves discuss when they think no human is paying attention. Curiosity got people killed in towns like this. It was raining harder when I reached the corner table, the one always left empty, the one nobody sat at without invitation. Tonight, an envoy in deep gray furs occupied it, flanked by 2 silent guards. I set down their drinks and turned to go, eager to disappear back into the noise. You, girl. I stopped. The voice belonged to the envoy, and something in his tone made the hair on my arms rise. Not fear, exactly, but the particular alertness you learn when you've spent your whole life being the smallest thing in every room. Yes, sir? You're the one who delivers the supply orders to the Eastern Keep, aren't you? The healing house? I blinked. Sometimes, when Mira needs an extra hand, and old Thomas can't make the ride. The envoy studied me with an unreadable expression, the kind wolves wore when they were deciding whether something was useful or simply in the way. There's a position opening, permanent. The Alpha King's household needs someone to bring meals to his private chambers, someone who won't gossip, won't stare, won't ask questions. His eyes flicked over me, dismissive and assessing all at once. You seem unremarkable enough. It should have stung. Instead, something in my chest went very still, the way it does right before you step off solid ground. I knew the stories, of course. Everyone in the valley did. King Orion, ruler of the Thornfield Pack, the strongest alpha bloodline in 3 territories, struck down 20 years ago by something no healer, no witch, no traveling physician had ever named. Paralyzed from the chest down since before I was even born. He ruled from a chair carried by 4 men, his voice still law, his body a cage he'd never escaped. They said he hadn't left his keep in over a decade. They said his temper had grown as still and cold as his legs. They said many things, and I had learned not to trust half of what people said about men they feared. I have a position here, I said carefully, at the inn. This pays 4 times what you make pouring ale. The envoy's mouth curved, not quite a smile. And it's not a request exactly. The keep needs filling. You were recommended. Recommended. By whom, I wondered, and why me? Plain, quiet, unremarkable me, who had spent 5 years perfecting the art of being overlooked. I should have said no. Every instinct screamed at me that nothing good came from human girls disappearing into alpha keeps, no matter how dull the assignment sounded on paper. But I thought of the coins in the jar under my bed. Never quite enough. And the way my mother's cough had started rattling deeper in her chest these last few winters. And I thought, perhaps foolishly, that 4 times my wage might finally be enough to send her somewhere warm. "When do I start?" I asked. The envoy's eyes glinted with something I couldn't name. Satisfaction, maybe. Or pity. "Tomorrow, dawn. Don't be late. The king does not tolerate tardiness, even from those he never sees." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed above the inn's kitchen, listening to rain drum against the shutters, turning the envoy's words over and over until they lost their shape. He does not tolerate tardiness, even from those he never sees. What kind of man issued threats about a meeting he had no intention of attending? Dawn came gray and reluctant, fog pooling low over the cobblestones as I walked the long road toward Thornfield Keep, my one good cloak wrapped tight against the chill. The keep itself rose out of the mist, like something carved rather than built. Black stone, ancient ironwork, windows like watching eyes. I had passed it 100 times in my life and never once imagined I'd walk through its gates. The household staff who received me at the servants' entrance were brisk, efficient, uninterested in my name beyond the moment it took to write it in a ledger. A stern-faced woman named Greta showed me the kitchens, the narrow service stairs, the tray I was to prepare each morning and evening. Broth, bread, whatever the healers had prescribed that week, nothing too heavy, nothing the king's body might reject. "You knock twice," Greta instructed, her voice flat with the boredom of repetition. "You wait for permission. You set the tray on the side table. You do not approach the bed. You do not speak unless spoken to. And above all," here her eyes sharpened, fixing on me with sudden weight, "you do not stare. Whatever you see in that room, you forget it the moment you leave. Understood?" "Understood," I said, though I didn't understand at all. Not yet. That evening, tray in hand, heart hammering harder than the situation seemed to warrant, I climbed the service stairs to the king's private chambers for the first time. I knocked twice, as instructed. Waited. The silence stretched so long I nearly turned back, certain I'd misheard, certain no one was there at all. Then, low and rough, like a voice unused to speaking, "Come in." I pushed open the door into a room lit by a single fire, heavy curtains drawn against the dusk, the air thick with the particular stillness of a space that had not changed in a very long time. And there, in a chair angled toward the window though the curtains blocked any view, sat the Alpha King himself, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, his face carved with the kind of sharp, weathered handsomeness that made my breath catch despite every warning Greta had given me. His eyes found mine before I could lower my gaze the way I'd been taught. And for one suspended, terrible moment, neither of us looked away. I broke eye contact first. I always did. It was the rule beneath all of Greta's rules, the one nobody needed to say aloud. You did not hold a king's gaze, not even by accident. Not even for the length of a single breath. "Your tray, my lord," I said, setting it down on the side table with hands that were steadier than I felt. "Broth, and the bread the healer requested. I'll come back for the dishes in an hour, unless you'd like me to wait." Silence answered me. I risked one glance upward, just enough to confirm he was still watching, and found his expression unreadable. Not angry, not curious, just tired in a way that seemed to go bone deep, the particular exhaustion of a man who had stopped expecting anything from his days. "You're new," he said finally. Not a question. "Yes, my lord. Started this morning. They usually last a week before they ask to be reassigned." His mouth twisted, something between amusement and bitterness. "The room unsettles them. I unsettle them." I didn't know what answer he wanted, so I gave him the truth instead. "I don't frighten easily, my lord. I've worked the tavern floor for 5 years. I've seen worse than a quiet room." Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, that I'd spoken at all without being asked a direct question. "What's your name?" "Josie. Josie." He said it like he was testing the weight of it, the way you might turn over a coin to see if it was counterfeit. Go on then. I won't bite. Whatever the rumors say. I left before he could change his mind, my pulse refusing to settle until I was halfway down the service stairs. The days that followed fell into a rhythm I hadn't expected to find comforting. Morning tray, evening tray. The careful silence Greta had drilled into me slowly eroding, not through any deliberate effort on my part, but because King Orion seemed, against every story I'd heard about him, to want conversation. Small things at first. A comment about the weather. A question about the village I'd grown up in. By the end of the second week, he was asking about my mother. She's been ill, I admitted one evening, setting down his tray with more care than usual, because my hands had started shaking with exhaustion. I'd sat up with her the night before, listening to her cough rattle through the thin walls of our rooms above the inn. The cold settles in her chest every winter now. The healers say there's not much to be done beyond rest and warmth. And you came to work regardless. Someone has to pay for the wood that keeps her warm, my lord. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an intensity that made me want to look away, and didn't, this time. There's a healer in the Eastern Wing, older woman, trained in 3 different territories before she came to serve here. I'll have her sent to your mother. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. My lord, that's... I couldn't possibly ask. You didn't ask. I offered. His tone was clipped, almost defensive, as though kindness embarrassed him more than cruelty would have. Consider it part of your wages, if it eases your conscience. I thought foolishly of crying right there in front of him, and bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to stop it. Thank you, my lord. Truly. He waved a hand, dismissing the gratitude before it could fully land, but I caught the faint color rising along his jaw, and understood, with a small jolt of something I didn't yet have a name for, that the great Alpha King, feared across 3 territories, did not know what to do with simple thanks. The healer came the next day. My mother's cough eased within the week. I found myself looking forward to the climb up the service stairs in a way that frightened me more than the rumors ever had. Orion, I'd started thinking of him by name, privately, a small act of rebellion I never spoke aloud, was nothing like the cold, broken figure the village whispered about. He was sharp-tongued, yes, and carried a weight of old bitterness that surfaced in unguarded moments, but beneath it I began to glimpse something else. A man who had simply stopped being seen as a person 20 years ago, the day his legs stopped answering him, and had never quite recovered from the loneliness of that disappearance. I understood that loneliness better than I wanted to admit. 20 years, he said one night, unprompted, staring into the fire while I gathered the empty dishes. 20 years of healers and witches and so-called miracle workers parading through this room, prodding at me like I'm a puzzle to be solved rather than a man to be spoken to. Do you know what that does to a person, Josie? Being studied instead of seen? I think I might, I said quietly, before I could stop myself. He turned, surprised. Explain. People look at trays, my lord, not at the hands that carry them. I shrugged, embarrassed at how much I'd revealed. It's not the same as what you've endured, but I understand what it is to be in a room full of people and still be invisible. For a long moment, he said nothing, then quietly, "You're not invisible to me." The word settled somewhere beneath my ribs and stayed there, warm and unwelcome, all the way back down the service stairs. It was nearly a month into my service when the first real trouble arrived, not from within the keep, but from outside it, in the shape of a rider who came pounding through the gates at midday, half-frozen and grim-faced, demanding an audience with the king's council. I was in the kitchens when the news spread, passed from servant to servant in hushed, urgent tones. A neighboring pack, the Voss territory, was making moves along the northern border. Talk of broken treaties, talk of war. That evening, when I carried Orion's tray upstairs, I found him not in his usual chair by the window but near the hearth, a council member's hurried departure still hanging in the air like smoke. "You've heard, I assume," he said without preamble. "Everyone in this keep has ears, even the ones who pretend not to." "I heard rumors, my lord. Nothing certain. The Voss envoy who recommended you for this position." He paused, and something in his face went carefully still. "He's the same envoy now threatening to march soldiers across my border. Did you know that?" My stomach dropped. "No, my lord, I didn't. I believe you." His eyes searched mine, and whatever he found there seemed to ease some private tension in his shoulders. "But understand this, Josie. A king who cannot walk is still a king the wolves fear, because fear doesn't require legs. It requires history and bloodline, and the willingness to remind enemies why that history exists." His jaw tightened. "Voss thinks 20 years of paralysis means 20 years of weakness. He's about to learn how wrong that assumption is." I should have felt only fear at those words, talk of war, of borders, of a threat that had walked unknowingly into the very tavern where I'd worked for 5 years. Instead, watching the fire-lit determination harden across his face, I felt something closer to awe. "What will you do?" I asked. "What I always do." His gaze flicked to me, something unreadable passing behind it. "I'll sit in this chair, and I'll be smarter than the men who think my legs determine my strength. And you?" He hesitated, as though debating whether to continue. "You'll be careful, going back and forth from the village. If Voss is testing my borders, he may also be watching who comes and goes from this keep." The warning settled cold in my chest, but beneath it, something else stirred. The unmistakable, dangerous warmth of being worried over, by a king who had no reason to spare a single thought for a human-serving girl beyond the tray she carried. I left that night with my mind full of borders and bloodlines and the particular weight of his eyes on me, and I did not yet understand that the real danger waiting for me had very little to do with Voss soldiers at all. 3 days passed before the next disturbance reached the keep, and in that time, I learned more about fear than I had in 5 years pouring drinks for soldiers twice my size. It started small. A guard posted outside my mother's door without explanation. A quiet word from Greta that I was no longer to walk the village road alone after dusk. When I asked why, no one would meet my eyes. It was Orion himself who finally told me, the following evening, his voice low and clipped with restrained anger. Voss soldiers were seen near the eastern road. 2 of my own scouts didn't return last night. He didn't look at me as he spoke, his gaze fixed instead on the fire, jaw tight enough that I could see the muscle working beneath his beard. "I won't pretend the timing is coincidence, Josie. You came to this keep on Voss's recommendation. I need to know why." The accusation, gentle as it was, still landed like a slap. "My lord, I swear to you, I had no connection to that envoy before that night at the inn. I didn't seek this position. It sought me." "I believe you," he said again, and this time the words came faster, almost defensive, as though he regretted the doubt the moment he'd voiced it. "I'm not accusing you. I'm trying to understand the shape of the trap before it closes." I set down the tray, my hands trembling slightly despite my best effort to steady them. What if it isn't a trap at all? What if the envoy simply needed someone who wouldn't ask questions, and I happened to fit? Then you're a convenient pawn rather than a willing one. His eyes finally lifted to mine, and the anger I'd braced for wasn't there. Only a tired, weary concern that startled me more than fury would have. "Either way, you're in danger now, whether you intended to be or not. I won't have that on my conscience. It's not your burden to carry, my lord. Everything in this keep is my burden to carry." His voice roughened. "That hasn't changed in 20 years, chair or no chair." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing at all, and the silence between us stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of conversation. The following week brought a council meeting that shook the keep to its foundations, or so the servants whispered, huddled together in corners, voices dropping whenever a guard passed. Voss had sent a formal declaration. Unless Thornfield ceded a strip of disputed borderland, soldiers would cross within the month. I wasn't meant to know any of this. Trays did not carry opinions, and serving girls were not invited to war councils. But Orion, in the quiet hours after each council session ended, began telling me anyway. Fragments at first, then fuller accounts, as though the act of speaking the worry aloud lightened something in his chest that 20 years of silence had only made heavier. They think because I cannot stand to greet them, I cannot stand against them, he said one night, bitterness sharp in his voice. Voss has built his entire strategy on that miscalculation. Is he wrong? I asked, daring more than I should have. Orion's gaze snapped to mine, surprised, and for a moment I feared I'd overstepped badly enough to end my position on the spot. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough to startle me further. No, he said, he's catastrophically wrong, and I intend to make that very clear. I found myself smiling back before I could stop myself, and something passed between us in that moment, quick, warm, entirely unspoken, that I chose not to examine too closely on the long walk home. It was 3 nights later that the real danger arrived, sudden and violent enough to scatter every careful rule Greta had ever taught me. I was climbing the service stairs with the evening tray when shouting erupted below, guards' voices, urgent and overlapping, followed by the unmistakable clash of steel. My first instinct was to freeze. My second, stronger instinct sent me running upward instead of down, toward the one room in this keep I knew, without question, needed warning. I burst through Orion's door without knocking, the tray forgotten somewhere on the stairs behind me. He looked up sharply from his chair, alarm flashing across his face at the sight of me disheveled and breathless. Josie, what? Soldiers, my lord, inside the walls. I heard fighting near the lower hall. His expression hardened instantly into something I hadn't seen before. Not the tired bitterness of a man confined to a chair, but the sharp, commanding focus of a king assessing a battlefield. The bell rope by the window. Pull it 3 times, hard. That signals the inner guard. I obeyed without hesitation, yanking the heavy rope until my arms ached, and somewhere below, a deep bell began tolling through the keep's stone halls. Now get behind the desk, he ordered, already reaching for the blade kept always within arm's reach of his chair, a habit I'd noticed weeks ago and never questioned. If anyone comes through that door who isn't wearing Thornfield colors, you do not hesitate, you do not negotiate. You run. I'm not leaving you, Josie. His voice cracked like a whip, sharper than I'd ever heard it. I cannot stand to defend this room. I can still use my hands, and I will, but I need you safe while I do. Please. The please undid me more than the command had. I ducked behind the desk, heart slamming against my ribs, and watched as Orion positioned himself with grim, practiced precision, blade resting across his lap, eyes fixed on the door. The fighting outside grew closer, then receded, then closer again. Chaos in the dark. Voices shouting commands I couldn't fully parse. I counted my own heartbeats to keep from screaming, pressed flat against the cold stone wall, until finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, the door burst open. It wasn't Voss soldiers. It was Greta, white-faced and out of breath, flanked by 2 of the inner guard. My lord, the intruders are contained. 3 breached the lower hall before the guard cut them down. No further threat to your chambers. Orion's shoulders dropped a fraction, tension bleeding out of him slowly. Casualties? 2 guards wounded, none of ours lost. Greta's eyes flicked toward the desk, finding me crouched there, and something like relief crossed her stern features before she caught herself. The girl is safe. I can see that, Orion said quietly, and when his gaze met mine across the room, I saw something there I hadn't let myself name until that exact moment. Not gratitude, not relief, but something deeper and far more dangerous. The particular look of a man realizing he could not bear the thought of losing someone he had only recently allowed himself to need. I rose from behind the desk, legs unsteady, and crossed the room toward him without entirely deciding to. You're unharmed. I'm unharmed. His voice had gone rough. You ran toward danger instead of away from it, Josie. Why? I didn't have a clever answer, only the truth, raw and unguarded in the aftermath of fear. Because I couldn't imagine doing anything else. Neither of us spoke again that night, but his hand found mine atop the desk, and for the first time in 20 years, I understood. The Alpha King allowed himself to be comforted rather than simply obeyed. The attack changed something in the keep, not just in the guards doubled at every entrance, or the council sessions that now stretched late into the night, but in the quiet space between Orion and me, which had shifted from careful distance into something neither of us spoke aloud, but both clearly felt. I no longer knocked twice, and waited at a polite remove. I no longer set the tray down, and left without lingering. Some nights, I stayed long after the dishes had gone cold, listening to him talk through council strategy, watching the firelight catch the silver threading through his dark hair, learning the particular cadence of his voice when he was tired versus when he was simply guarding himself from being known. You ask too many questions for a serving girl, he told me one evening, though there was no real complaint in it. You answer too many for a king who's meant to keep his cards close, I countered, and earned, for my trouble, the rare sight of him laughing. A low, surprised sound, as though the action itself had grown unfamiliar through disuse. It was during one of those long evenings that he finally told me the truth about his paralysis. Not the rumors, not the half-formed gossip that had followed him for 2 decades, but the real account, offered freely, without my asking. It wasn't an attack, he said, staring into the fire. Everyone assumes it was poison, or a rival pack's curse, or some battle wound dramatized into legend. The truth is far less interesting. I collapsed during a routine patrol. No enemy, no blade, no curse anyone could ever identify. One morning my legs simply stopped answering me, and they never started again. His mouth twisted bitterly. 20 years of healers, and not one of them could explain why. It's rather humiliating, being broken by nothing at all. It's not nothing, I said quietly. Whatever caused it, the result is real. That's not humiliating, my lord. That's just unfair. He looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen before, something unguarded, something almost startled by the gentleness of my response. You're the first person who's said that without trying to fix me or pity me in the same breath. I'm not trying to fix you, I admitted. I don't think you're broken. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I'd intended them to be. And for a long moment, neither of us looked away. The council, predictably, had opinions about my continued presence in the king's private chambers. Opinions that reached me secondhand through Greta's clipped warnings and the sideways glances of staff who had once ignored me entirely. They're saying you've grown too familiar, Greta told me bluntly, cornering me in the kitchen one morning. A human serving girl, alone with the king at all hours. You understand how that looks, Josie, regardless of how innocent it may be. Nothing improper has happened, I said, though heat crept up my neck at the accusation buried in her words. I didn't say it had. Greta's stern face softened, just slightly. I'm telling you what the council whispers, because someone should, before it reaches ears that matter more than mine. Be careful. Men like Voss look for any weakness to exploit, and a king distracted by personal attachments is a weakness, whether you intend it to be or not. I carried that warning with me up the service stairs that evening, heavier than the tray in my hands, and found Orion already troubled by news of his own. Voss has requested a formal audience, he said without preamble. 2 days from now. He claims it's to negotiate peace terms regarding the border dispute. His expression darkened. I don't trust a single word of that claim. What do you think he actually wants? To see for himself whether I'm as weak as he's been told, Orion's jaw set hard. And likely to test whether I have anything, or anyone, left worth protecting, that he might use as leverage. The implication settled cold in my stomach. Me. He didn't deny it. I won't let that happen, Josie. Whatever Voss intends, I won't let you become a casualty of his ambitions. I'm not asking you to protect me at the cost of your kingdom, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I came here to bring you meals and stay out of your council's business. I never meant to become anyone's leverage. You didn't choose this, he said, but I find myself unwilling to simply hand you back to a life where you're invisible again, regardless of what the council whispers. His eyes held mine, dark and unflinching. That should frighten me more than it does. Why doesn't it? Because for the first time in 20 years, he said quietly, I'd rather be afraid of losing something than numb to having nothing left to lose at all. The audience with Voss arrived 2 days later exactly as threatened, and I watched it unfold from the shadowed edge of the Great Hall, dismissed by protocol to the servants' gallery, but unable to stay away entirely. Voss strode in with the same cold confidence I remembered from the tavern, flanked by guards in dark gray, his eyes sweeping the hall with the practiced assessment of a man calculating advantage before a single word was spoken. Orion sat at the head of the hall in his chair, flanked not by weakness, but by an unmistakable, deliberate display of command, council members standing at sharp attention, guards positioned with calculated precision, every detail arranged to remind the room exactly whose territory this remained. 20 years, Voss said, not bothering with pleasantries. And you still play king from a chair, Orion. 20 years, Orion replied evenly. And Thornfield still stands while your border raids accomplish nothing but wasted soldiers. I'd reconsider which of us is playing at strength, Voss. The exchange that followed was sharp, layered with threats wrapped in diplomatic language, and I understood perhaps half of the political maneuvering at play, but I understood completely the moment Voss's gaze flicked toward the servants' gallery, toward me, with a slow, deliberate cruelty that made my blood run cold. I hear your household has grown rather attached, Voss said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. A human girl, wasn't it? Recommended for her unremarkable nature. How interesting that unremarkable has become so noteworthy. The hall went still. Orion's expression didn't change, but I saw his hand tighten, just slightly, against the arm of his chair. My household is not yours to discuss, Orion said, his voice dropping into something dangerously quiet. And I'd advise you to remember, Voss, that a king who cannot stand can still ensure you never walk out of disputed territory again, should you mistake my patience for permission. Voss's smile faltered, just barely, before he recovered it. A threat? From a man who can't rise to deliver one himself? A promise, Orion said. From a man who has spent 20 years learning exactly how much damage doesn't require legs to deliver. The audience ended without resolution, Voss departing with thinly veiled fury and renewed threats of border action. But I left the gallery shaking, not from fear of Voss, but from the realization, settling cold and certain in my chest, that I had become exactly the leverage Orion feared. And worse, far worse than any danger to myself, was the knowledge that I would not have changed a single moment that led me to this keep, this chair, this king, even knowing the cost might yet prove far higher than either of us had bargained for. The week after Voss's audience passed in a blur of tightened security and quiet dread, the keep humming with the particular tension of a household bracing for something it couldn't yet name. I continued my evening climbs up the service stairs, tray in hand, though Greta's warnings now followed me like a second shadow, and I noticed the guards posted at every turn watched me with new, careful attention. Not suspicion, exactly, but the wary vigilance of men who understood, perhaps better than I did myself, that I had become a target. Orion noticed it too. I saw it in the way his eyes tracked the door whenever I arrived, the way his shoulders only fully relaxed once I'd crossed the threshold and the bolt had been thrown behind me. "You shouldn't walk the lower corridors alone anymore," he told me one evening. Not quite an order, though it carried the weight of one. "Take the eastern passage instead. It's longer, but it stays within sight of the inner guard the entire way." "You're worried." "I'm cautious." His jaw tightened. "There's a difference, though I'll admit the line has grown thinner since Voss decided to make you part of his negotiations." I set the tray down and settled into the chair across from his, a habit that had become so natural over the past weeks that neither of us commented on it anymore. "What happens now? With Voss, I mean. Will there be war?" "There may be no avoiding it." Orion's gaze drifted toward the fire. Weariness etched into the lines of his face in a way I hadn't seen since my first week in this room. "My scouts report his forces massing near the Eastern Pass. Whatever peace he pretended to negotiate was theater, nothing more. He means to test whether grief, age, or a body that no longer obeys him have finally made me an easy conquest." "And have they?" He looked at me then, something fierce kindling behind the exhaustion. "No. They've made me something far more dangerous than I was 20 years ago, Josie. A man with nothing left to fear losing tends to fight carelessly. I am no longer that man." I understood, without him saying it plainly, exactly what, or who, had changed that calculation, and the knowledge settled in my chest with a weight equal parts fear and something warmer I no longer tried to deny. The attack, when it finally came, arrived not at night under cover of shadow, but in the gray hour just after dawn, when the keep's defenses were thinnest and the household least prepared. I was in the kitchens, helping Greta prepare the morning trays, when the first horn sounded, 3 long blasts that sent every servant in the room rigid with recognition. "That's the border signal," Greta breathed, color draining from her face. "They've breached the outer wall." What followed was chaos of a kind I'd never witnessed, even on the worst nights at the tavern. Guards running through corridors, shouted commands overlapping until they became indistinguishable, the distant clash of steel growing steadily, terrifyingly closer. Greta seized my arm and pulled me toward the servants' stairwell, the designated safe passage in the event of breach. But I dug in my heels the moment I understood where the fighting was concentrated. "They're moving toward the King's Wing," I said, ice flooding my veins. "Greta, they're heading for Orion." "Then the guard will defend him, as they're trained to. Your duty is to get to safety, Josie, not run toward the fighting." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I broke from her grip and ran, ignoring every rule Greta had ever drilled into me, every careful boundary I'd maintained for 5 years of learning to be invisible. The corridors blurred past, smoke beginning to curl along the ceiling from some fire I couldn't yet see the source of. The sounds of battle growing sharper and closer with every turn. I reached the King's private wing to find the outer guard locked in brutal combat, with at least a dozen Voss soldiers, steel ringing against steel, the air thick with shouted commands, and the particular metallic scent of violence that I would spend the rest of my life trying to forget. Through the chaos, I caught sight of the door to Orion's chamber, half open, 2 guards down before it, and beyond them, 3 soldiers advancing on the room where I knew, with absolute certainty, the king would be waiting with nothing but a blade and his own unyielding will to defend himself. I didn't think. I acted, the way I had that first night of the attack, some instinct deeper than fear driving me forward. I grabbed a fallen guard's discarded shield from the corridor floor, heavier than I expected, the edge biting into my palms, and threw myself between the advancing soldiers and the doorway, screaming for the inner guard with everything my lungs could manage. The soldiers hesitated at the sight of me, confusion flickering across their faces at the unexpected obstacle of a human servant girl standing her ground, where trained warriors had already fallen. And that hesitation, small, foolish, costly, gave the inner guard precious seconds to round the corridor and engage. I was shoved aside in the scramble that followed, my shoulder striking stone hard enough to steal my breath. But I scrambled upright and pushed through the door into Orion's chamber regardless. He was exactly where I'd feared and hoped to find him. Chair angled to face the entrance, blade drawn, eyes blazing with a fury I'd never witnessed in him before. Relief and terror crossed his face in the same instant he saw me. "Josie, get behind." The door slammed open fully as one soldier broke past the corridor fighting, blade raised, and I watched with horror as he lunged not toward Orion, but toward me, calculating correctly that I represented the king's single greatest vulnerability. What happened next, unfolded in fragments I would replay for the rest of my life. Orion's roar of fury as he hauled himself forward in the chair with strength I hadn't known he possessed, his blade catching the soldier's strike at the last possible instant. Steel meeting. Steel close enough that I felt the displaced air against my face. The soldier staggered back, recalibrating his attack, and in that single suspended moment, Orion's eyes met mine. "Move," he commanded, voice raw with desperation. "Now, Josie." I scrambled sideways as the soldier renewed his assault, and what I witnessed in the next several seconds defied every story I'd ever heard about the king's 20 years of helplessness. Confined to his chair, Orion fought with the brutal, economical precision of a man who had spent 2 decades training his upper body to compensate for what his legs could no longer provide. Each strike calculated, each block absolute, until the soldier who had underestimated a paralyzed king lay defeated at the foot of his chair, disarmed and bleeding from a wound that would heal far better than his pride. The inner guard flooded through the doorway moments later, securing the room, and the larger battle beyond gradually fell into the particular ringing silence that follows violence finally spent. I sat frozen against the wall where I'd scrambled for cover, watching Orion's chest heave with exertion, his eyes finding mine across the wreckage of the room. "You could have died," he said, voice shaking with something far more raw than anger. "Running into that corridor. Josie, you could have died. And for what? For me?" "Yes," I said simply, because there was no other honest answer left in me. "For you." The aftermath of the attack stretched across days that blurred together. Wounded guards tended, the breach in the outer wall repaired, council sessions convened to determine Thornfield's response to what could no longer be dismissed as mere border posturing. Voss had overplayed his hand catastrophically. Word spread quickly through the territories that the Alpha King, far from the broken figure rumor had painted, had personally repelled an assassination attempt from a wheelchair, and the political tide began shifting in ways even Orion hadn't fully anticipated. But none of that mattered to me nearly as much as the quiet hour, 3 nights after the attack, when Orion asked Greta to leave us alone in his chambers, and I understood, with a tightening in my chest, that whatever conversation waited would change everything between us. "I've spent 20 years believing my body made certain things impossible for me," he said, staring into the fire rather than at me, his voice unusually unsteady. "Not just walking, not just defending my own halls without strategy and compensation. I believed, convinced myself, rather thoroughly, that I had no business wanting anything beyond survival and duty. That love, companionship, any of it, belonged to a version of myself that died the morning my legs stopped answering me. "And now?" I asked quietly, though I already feared and hoped I knew his answer. "Now I find myself terrified of an entirely different impossibility," he said, finally turning to look at me. "Watching you run toward danger instead of away from it, not once but twice now, and understanding that I would burn every treaty, break every council rule, defy every expectation this crown has ever placed on me before I'd allow anything to take you from this keep." His jaw tightened. "I don't know what to call that, Josie, except the thing I swore 20 years ago I'd never permit myself to feel again." My throat closed around words I wasn't certain I trusted myself to speak aloud. "My lord, Orion," he corrected, soft and certain. "Just Orion, please." "Orion," I repeated, and something in his expression broke open at the sound of his own name, stripped of title, offered freely. "I came to this keep to deliver trays and stay invisible. I never expected—" I gestured helplessly between us. unable to find adequate words for everything that had grown in the space of these past weeks. I never expected to matter to anyone the way I seem to matter here. To you. You matter, he said, voice rough with conviction. More than this crown. More than this chair. More than 20 years of believing I had nothing left worth fighting for beyond duty. You walked into a room full of soldiers with nothing but a shield and stubbornness. And you didn't hesitate, Josie. Not once. I have commanded armies who hesitated less bravely than you did in that corridor. I crossed the room without deciding to, kneeling beside his chair so our eyes met level for the first time since I'd entered this room weeks ago. I wasn't being brave. I simply couldn't imagine a version of that morning where I didn't try. That, he said quietly, is precisely what bravery is, Josie. The people who claim otherwise have simply never loved anyone enough to test the theory. The word love settled between us, unhurried and entirely unafraid, and for a long moment neither of us moved to fill the silence that followed, content, instead, to simply exist in the quiet certainty of having found, against every expectation either of us carried into that room, exactly where we belonged. The council, predictably, took longer to accept what Orion had decided in the space of a single conversation. There were objections, quiet ones, murmured in corridors, regarding propriety and bloodlines and the political complications of an alpha king, choosing a human companion over the more traditional alliances his advisors had long assumed he'd eventually entertain. But Orion, having spent 20 years being underestimated by enemies and overlooked by allies in equal measure, proved entirely unmoved by objections that no longer carried any weight against the clarity of what he wanted. Thornfield has survived 2 decades under a king the territories assumed was finished, he told his assembled council, voice carrying the particular authority that no chair, no paralysis, no 20 years of doubt had ever managed to diminish. It will survive this decision as well, and any advisor who believes otherwise is welcome to test that theory against the same blade that turned back Voss's assassins 3 nights past. No one tested the theory. Voss, for his part, retreated from the border within the month, his political standing among the territories badly damaged by the failed assassination and the subsequent revelation of Orion's continued, formidable capability. The disputed land remained Thornfield's, secured not through war, but through the simple, undeniable proof that underestimating a king confined to a chair had cost Voss far more than the conflict had ever been worth. My mother, fully recovered under the care of the keep's healer, moved into modest rooms within Thornfield's village before the season turned, close enough that I visited every week, far enough that she maintained the quiet independence she'd always valued. She met Orion only once, in the early days of that following spring, and I watched with quiet amusement as the Alpha King who had faced down assassins without flinching seemed entirely undone by the prospect of a mother's careful scrutiny. "He's stubborn," she told me afterward, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who recognized a kindred trait. "Stubborn and entirely smitten, and I imagine he'll drive you half mad within the decade. You have my blessing, for whatever that's worth to a king." "It's worth everything," I told her, and meant it entirely. I never returned to the tavern, though I visited Mira often enough that the gap in my absence never quite hardened into distance. The Hollow Pine Inn remained, much as it always had, a way station for soldiers and merchants passing through a valley that no longer feared, quite so deeply, the shadow of Voss's ambitions along its northern border. What changed instead was everything within Thornfield. Keep itself, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the steady accumulation of small certainties that built, day by day, into something neither Orion nor I had dared imagine possible in those first careful weeks of trays and silence and rules about not staring. He still could not stand. 20 years of unexplained paralysis had not reversed itself through love or determination or any of the convenient miracles certain old tales might have promised. But I had learned, in the months since that first knock on his chamber door, that strength had never required legs in the first place. Not for Orion, who had defended his halls and his crown, and eventually me, from a chair that the territories had once mistaken for weakness. And not for myself, who had spent 5 years believing invisibility was the safest thing a human girl could offer a world built for wolves, only to discover that the bravest thing I'd ever done was stop hiding at all. On the morning Orion asked me, quietly and without ceremony, to remain in Thornfield not as a servant carrying trays, but as someone he intended to build the rest of his life around, I said yes before he'd even finished the question. Not because the answer required thought, but because I had known it, with quiet certainty, since the night I'd thrown myself between a soldier's blade and the man I'd once been warned never to stare at directly. The council formalized what we both already understood within the season. The territories, slowly, grudgingly, came to accept what Voss's failed ambitions had inadvertently proven beyond doubt. That Thornfield's king, paralyzed or not, remained exactly as formidable, exactly as worth fearing and respecting, as he had been before illness ever touched him. And that the quiet, unremarkable serving girl who had once delivered his meals in careful silence had become, in her own right, someone the keep now spoke of with the particular reverence reserved for those who had proven their worth. Not through bloodline, but through choosing courage when every easier path lay open before her. I think often of that first night, the rain against the tavern windows, the envoy's dismissive assessment of my unremarkable nature, the long walk through fog toward a keep I never imagined I'd call home. I think of how close I came to refusing the position entirely, to remaining safely invisible in a world that had taught me invisibility was survival. I am glad, beyond any words adequate to the feeling, that I said yes instead. 20 years of paralysis. No healer or witch or traveling physician had ever managed to cure. But sitting beside Orion now, watching firelight catch silver in his dark hair, while he laughs at something our young niece has said during her visit from the village, I understand finally what no medicine in 3 territories had ever offered him. Not a cure for what his body could no longer do, but a reason, entirely his own, to stop measuring his worth by the things he'd lost, and start measuring it instead by everything he'd finally allowed himself to keep. The fire burns low. Orion's hand finds mine, steady and certain, the way it has every evening since that first night the bell rope sounded through these stone halls. Outside, beyond the heavy curtains he no longer keeps drawn quite so tightly, the valley settles into the particular peace of a kingdom no longer bracing for war. A peace neither of us takes for granted, having learned, each in our own way, exactly how much courage it costs to build something worth protecting. This is where the story ends. Not because anything remains unresolved, but because everything that needed resolving finally has. The king who learned his strength never depended on his legs. The girl who learned invisibility was never truly safety, and the quiet, certain love that grew between them in the space where a tray once sat, careful and untouched, on a side table neither of us ever needed again.